In the last video on this topic, we looked at a number of different electoral systems and the general trends we see in results brought about by elections held in a certain way. However, as we touched on in the last video, we can and should look deeper than the broad classifications of plurality, majoritarian, proportional and mixed systems. We're going to be doing that today. First past the post is usually considered the most important electoral system in the UK. This is because it is used to elect the House of Commons, our representatives who form the government and make the majority of our laws. Now, first past the post is a plurality system, which, as we touched on last time, means that a candidate only needs one more vote than the candidate who finished second to win the election. This means that a candidate doesn't actually need the support of the majority of the electorate to win their election and thus their seat. This has led some to criticise the use of first past the post and call for its abolition, as it tends to produce disproportionate outcomes. This has been termed a winner's bonus, as first past the post tends to overstate the popularity of the most supported party. This means that just a relatively small percentage of votes lead over the second place party will often result in a relatively larger amount of seats in the House of Commons. For example, in the 2005 general election, Labour won with 35.2% of the vote, whilst the Conservative came second with 32.4% of the vote, whilst the Liberal Democrats took 22% of the vote. Despite this, if we were to look at the number of seats that the parties actually won in the House of Commons, it will suggest a landslide victory for Labour, who came away with 355 seats, 55%, whilst the Conservatives, who were less than 3% behind the party in vote share, only received 198 seats, which is 30.6%. The Liberal Democrats were treated even worse, however, only receiving 62 seats, equating to just 9.6% of total seats in the House, despite them having 22% of the electorate vote for them. Results like this, where smaller parties like the Lib Dems perform well in vote share, but not well enough to overcome the Conservatives or Labour in many constituencies, has led many to highlight how first past the post has created a two-party system that works to the benefits of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, whilst at the same time preventing smaller parties from gaining ground in the UK. This is because first past the post favours parties with strong nationwide support, which effectively means enough support to win in the majority of constituencies. This gives the party a good chance of securing a parliamentary majority. For example, at general elections, the Conservative or Labour Party tends to have a good amount of support in most constituencies across the UK. This means that although they may not dominate any single constituency with a 70 or 80% vote share, they'll have enough to easily win the majority of them. This leads to a two-party system, as most constituencies has enough Conservative or Labour voters to stop candidates from smaller parties like the Liberal Democrats or the Greens from gaining a significant number of seats and having a realistic chance of getting into government. This is compounded by an issue of psychology. Many voters feel that votes for these smaller parties is little more than wasting their votes, as they have virtually no chance of getting to government. This dissuades people from voting for these smaller parties that may better align with their own viewpoints. Instead, they choose to vote for whichever largest party is close to their views, or the least worst. There are certain exceptions to the rule. The most noticeable one is the Scottish National Party, that tends to see an overinflated number of Westminster seats when compared to its voting numbers. However, it is important to remember that the SNP just targets voters in Scotland, and as the SNP do have a relatively strong amount of support concentrated in Scotland, they managed to win the vast majority of seats. 48 out of the 59 available seats in the 2019 general election were won by the party, despite them only receiving 45% of the Scottish vote. Thus we can conclude that whilst first past the post does create a two-party system, certain regional parties can act as an exception and outperform their vote share. All of this means that elections held under a first past the post system tend to lead to strong single-party governments who have enough of a majority to push through their policies. In fact, since the end of the Second World War, there has only been minority governments in the February 1974 election, the 2010 election, and the 2017 election, and whilst only the February 2010 election actually led to a coalition, it was the first one since the coalition in the Second World War. This can leave the UK acting as an elected dictatorship. However, others argue that it allows the country to act quickly and respond decisively to national and international crisis. Whilst we have a look at the outcomes produced by first past the post, there are a few features about how they are held that are important to know as well. This is the existence of constituencies and of safe and marginal seats. A UK general election effectively works as 650 local elections, taking place at the same time, on the same day, and with the same goal: to elect a representative for your constituency. These are political boundaries made up of around 65,000 to 75,000 so people. each of which elects one representative to the House of Commons. These boundaries are redrawn every 8 to 12 years to reflect population changes by the Independent Boundaries Commission. There are a few exceptions to this rule, however. For example, the Isle of Wight is by far the largest constituency in the UK, with 113,021 constituents as of the 2019 general election. This contrasts with Nar Ha Elian Ha Allah, apologies for the pronunciation, in the Outer Hebrides that has an electorate of just under 21,000. This is partially due to a rule that allows for significant geographical features to be taken into account when drawing up borders, which is partially why the Isle of Wight only has one MP. Constituencies and their boundaries are incredibly important to the outcome of first past post elections. Constituencies can be divided into two groups, those that are safe and those that are marginal. This is done based on how competitive the seat is, and marginal seats are often where the elections are won or lost. A safe seat is one that a party will consistently win every election, usually due to the incumbent possessing a large majority. At the 2017 general election, the safest seat was Liverpool Walton, where the Labour Party, who have held the seat since the 1964 general election, had 86% of the vote. On the other hand, marginal seats are those that are the most competitive, regularly changing hands at elections and are usually characterised by small majorities and high levels of voter turnout. Political parties will put the majority of money and campaign focus into these seats, as this is where the election is ultimately won or lost. The number of marginal seats has been in decline for a long time. This was until the last two elections. In 2017, 11 super-marginal constituencies were produced, which is where the majority was less than 100, with the smallest being North East Fife, where the SNP won by just 2 votes, which really shows the difference a single vote can make. This was followed up by the collapse of the famous Red Wall, a grouping of Labour safe seats in the north of England and Wales that flipped to the Conservative Party following the 2019 general election. This outcome, and the Conservative landslide that saw them win 365 seats, up from 317 in 2017, was largely driven by historically Labour Red Wall seats voting Conservative, often for the first time in decades. Now that we have a better understanding of just what exactly first past the post is and how it works, it is important that we explore some of its advantages and disadvantages so that we are properly informed on debates about reform. Many who support first past the post argue that its simplicity is one of its greatest strengths. The idea of one person, one vote is easy for candidates to understand, especially when compared to other systems that require you to list candidates or select preferences. This is especially true as first past to the post has been used in the UK for hundreds of years, and counting is especially straightforward, which means a winner can be announced quickly and importantly with a clear winner. This helps create a strong and stable government, as the winner's bonus allows major parties to quickly form a government and begin enacting their manifesto pledges, which saves the country potentially months of waiting for coalition agreements to be hammered out, and is useful if the government faces an immediate crisis. Governments can take their place quickly and are clearly defined, often by one of the two major parties. This allows voters to easily judge the record of the governing party when election time comes around, and compare it to the record of the opposition to decide who they would like to see running the country. Another noticeable positive with first past the post is the clear link between the representative and the electorate. In a first past the post system, everyone will have one person representing them that they can go to if they have any issues or complaints. This isn't the case with other electoral systems that may see the electorate being represented by multiple people, potentially from different parties. That can make consulting with them difficult. Finally, one often forgotten about benefit with first past the post is how it prevents extremist far right and far left parties from getting into government. Generally, the parties that best perform are those that are closest to the centre. For example, UKIP failed to gain many seats in the House of Commons despite its vote share, due to its lack of appeal among the broader electorate. This prevents the UK and other countries using first past the post from sliding too far to the left or to the right. However, despite the benefits, first past the post still has its critics. Many argue that the benefits are not worth the fundamentally disproportionate outcomes created by the electoral system. They argue that as the number of seats won by various political parties doesn't translate to their number of votes, we cannot truly view the system as competent, as it gives the two main parties a greater number of seats than their vote share indicates, whilst leaving third parties underrepresented in the House. They also argue that this leads to regions in the country where one party is significantly underrepresented. For example, after the 2019 general election, Labour have virtually no representation in the south of England, with the exception of some London seats and a few other urban areas. After the 2017 general election, despite having 38% of votes in the region, the Conservatives only had 10% of the seats in the northeast of England. This creates regions where, despite having a good amount of vote share, a party has virtually no representation. Some have argued that first past the post leads to divisive politics. Interestingly, in the post-war period of British history, we've seen two opposing trends. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, we saw regular changes in government that was brought about by small changes in voting patterns. This led to massive instability growing in the UK and played a role in its sick man of Europe image at the time. However, since 1979, first past the post has led to long periods of one-party rule, with the Conservatives ruling from 1979 to 1994 under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and from 2010 to today, with Cameron, Johnson and May all having since as Prime Minister, whilst Labour ruled from 1994 to 2010 under Brown and Blair. Some would argue that this leads to poor governance and complacency as parties are in for too long. This has led to some people calling for electoral reform, and despite a referendum on a switch to alternate vote in 2011, first past the post continues to be used. Whether you believe it to be the best system for the job, a workable compromise, or something that needs to be replaced, however, is up to you. Supplementary vote was brought in by Tony Blair for use in the London mayoral elections and for elections for the Police and Crime Commissioner. However, David Cameron also decided to use the same system to elect the Metro mayors. First introduced in 1998, SV is a majoritarian system. This means that to win, the candidate will actually need to obtain more than 50% of all votes cast. When compared to some of the systems we will look at, supplementary vote has a lot in common with first past the post. The only difference is that instead of voting once, you instead add a second preference. Whilst you aren't obligated to make a second choice if you don't want to, it gives you the option of voting for a smaller party first without the fear of wasting your votes. For example, a Conservative voter may only use their first preference to vote for the Conservatives, largely due to them being the only political option for mainstream right in the UK, whilst a left-leaning voter may opt to use their first preference to support a Green candidate who they wouldn't normally vote for in a general election in the hopes they might win. However, they would then use their second preference to vote for Labour, who they may like less but view as a more credible opposition to the Conservatives. The count is done in two rounds. In the first round, all first preference votes are counted, and if any candidate has more than 50% of the votes, they win and it ends there. However, if no candidate has achieved the required 50% or more to win, all candidates apart from the first two highest scoring ones are eliminated. Anyone who has then had their vote limited will instead have the second preference counted. However, in the second round, you only need a majority of the total electorate. You don't actually need more than 50%. This is because, if people had more than 2 votes, there could be many recounts which would lead to gridlock. Generally, a candidate will have over 50% in the second round, but if they don't, they are still seen to have sufficient mandate, with many arguing that they'll have greater legitimacy than an election held under first past the post. It does mean that if someone voted for the Lib Dems and the Greens, and the final two are the Conservatives and Labour, their vote effectively wouldn't be counted. And it means that all voters really have to have voted for one of the two final candidates to actually affect the outcome. Some argue, however, that voters aren't actually getting more choice through this method, but simply getting an opportunity to select the least worst or the least unpopular option, with critics arguing it still ultimately leads to the two-party system. There is some truth to this, as in fact every London mayoral election, apart from the first, had the second preferences ultimately come down to Conservatives and Labour. Whilst it would be relatively easy to implement supplementary vote as a replacement to first past the post in general elections, they both have the issue of not creating a truly proportional outcome and both lead to strong single-party governments. Additional member system is a mixed electoral system that combines elements of first past the post and regional list, which is a form of proportional representation. In the UK, we use it to elect representatives to the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments as well as to the London Assembly. It is a mixed system as a certain number of seats inside the legislative chamber are elected using first past the post in single member constituencies, however a smaller number of seats are then elected using regional list. This means that on election day, electors will cast 2 votes. The first is for a known candidate in the first past the post method, the same that we use for general elections, whilst the second vote isn't for an individual candidate, but instead for a chosen political party. This is because the closed list variant of the regional list system is used. This means that the parties will all make a list of their chosen candidates for the regional list seats, and will then elect members based on how many seats the party wins. Whilst the electors can see the party candidates, they cannot choose who they wish to represent them, and they can only vote for the party or for an independent candidate. When allocating the regional seats, a method known as the D'Hondt formula is used. This is done so that the outcome of the regional seats is more proportional than simply using first past the post would be. Thus, allocating the regional seats first begins with the initial count, and then the party with the highest number of votes gets the first regional seat. However, to ensure that the outcome is proportionate, all future vote counts use the D'Hondt formula to reapportion the outcome. This is done multiple number of times until you have the number of regional list MPs required. In Scotland, this is 7. The D'Hondt formula is number of votes divided by the number of seats won plus 1. We do generally see coalition or minority governments in AMS elections, with Labour, who have ruled well since the formation of the Senedd, always being in coalition or acting as a minority government. Whilst the SNP did come very close to achieving a full majority in the 2021 elections, they still had to enter into a coalition with the Green Party. By blending elements of first past the post and proportional representation, AMS manages to strike a balance between allowing for the valuable constituency representation of first past the post, whilst creating a more proportional result than we tend to see. This means that votes are less likely to be wasted, whilst also allowing for split-ticketed voting, meaning that voters can vote for 2 different parties if they wish to do so. This could be valuable if, for example, you wanted to support an independent candidate in your constituency, but still support one of the large parties on the regional list. However, it has created 2 distinct categories of representatives within parliaments, those who have constituency duties and those who do not, which has created some tension in the past. Another issue many have with this system is that despite its best intentions, in smaller legislative assemblies with low numbers of regional list members, the outcomes aren't really proportionate. Some people also take lists with the closed list system, which effectively gives parties control over who represents the people, not giving them a choice. Single transferable vote is the electoral system used to elect representatives in Northern Ireland. It was also previously used in European elections in the UK. The election uses a number of large multi-member constituencies. For example, in Northern Ireland there are 18 constituencies, each electing 6 members. Electors will be given a list of candidates and instructed to order them, with one being their first preference and so on. However, voters don't have to list every candidate, just simply as many as they would like. Parties can put up as many candidates as there are seats to be won. However, an elector cannot just block vote for a party, but must list every representative as a preference. For example, if someone in Northern Ireland wished to vote for the DUP, and who were running 6 candidates in a constituency, they would have to list all DUP candidates from 1 to 6 when making their vote. For a candidate to be elected, they need to achieve a certain quota of votes. This quota is calculated using the Droop formula. Votes are counted based on voters' first preferences, and once a candidate achieves the quota needed to gain a seat, the remaining votes for that candidate shift over to the second preference votes, and counting begins again to determine the second seat, and so on. Despite this, if no candidate achieves the quota on the first round of voting, then the lowest placed candidate is eliminated, and anyone who uses their first preference on them has their votes recounted with their second preference. This process of elimination and redistribution will continue until the required numbers of seats are met. The Droop formula is valid votes cast over seats available plus 1, with a final 1 added on at the end. The use of the Droop formula helps to ensure a more proportional outcome when compared to first past the post, as it helps make all votes of equal value, which isn't the case with first past the post. It does this by redistributing votes among preferences and using multi-member constituencies. The government is often seen to be legitimate and is ruling with the consent of the population, as it is likely to consist of a party or coalition that together has more than 50% of the vote share, giving them a high level of legitimacy and a strong mandate. Minor parties are also likely to be able to gain at least some foothold due to the redistribution of votes, meaning that a great variety of views is represented in the legislature. This variety is helped by the ability of voters to choose candidates from the party, meaning that they can favour a candidate that best aligns with their views, thus increasing the range of views and voter choice. However, when compared to other systems of proportional representation, it can be less accurate at translating votes into seats than regional lists. And despite the wider viewpoints represented, the large multi-member constituencies do weaken the links between MPs and their constituents. Despite the growth in minor parties promoting different viewpoints, we tend to see that in STV, coalition governments formed tend to be unstable and can give significant influences to these minor parties. STV also leads to donkey voting, which is where those uninformed on the system simply list all the candidates instead of just those they like, which can skew the result quite heavily. Its use in Northern Ireland derives from the Good Friday Agreement, which officially ended the Troubles. As part of the peace deal, a power-sharing agreement was implemented, preventing one party from governing alone. Since peace, the government has always been a coalition of the Republican Sinn Féin, who were the political wing of the IRA, and the DUP, a political wing of various Protestant paramilitary groups loyal to the UK. Elections for Stormont are expensive and complicated, with twice as many counters needed for Northern Ireland Assembly elections than for general elections in Northern Ireland. However, the system is crucial in preserving peace. Thanks for watching this episode, and apologies for the delay with uploading. Hopefully uploads should start to come out quicker in the future. Next episode we will be evaluating the impact of these systems on the UK and examining the debate over electoral reform.